She laughed when my name was erased from my husband's will, but she didn't notice the second document sitting right in front of her. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to law offices where lives are quietly rearranged with ink and signatures. And I remember how still everything felt in that moment, how even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to hesitate as Mr. Cole adjusted his glasses and prepared to read the final terms, while across from me, Olivia Whitmore let out a soft, satisfied laugh that she didn't even bother to hide, the sound light and careless as if she were reacting to a joke instead of the dismantling of a woman's entire life. And beside her, my son Daniel sat with his hands folded too neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed somewhere just above the table, as though looking at me directly might force him to acknowledge what he had allowed to happen. And I studied them both in silence. The young woman I had once welcomed into my home, now leaning back in her chair with that same polished smile she wore at dinner parties, her blonde hair falling perfectly over her shoulders, her expression composed but unmistakably pleased. And I realized then that this moment, this exact moment, was the one she had been waiting for, the quiet confirmation that everything she had worked toward had finally fallen into place. And yet I felt no urge to argue, no sudden rush of anger or desperation, because something inside me had already shifted days earlier, something that had turned my grief into something far more precise, far more patient. And I let my hands rest calmly in my lap, fingers loosely intertwined, as if I were nothing more than an observer in a room where my future was being decided by others. And perhaps that was exactly what they believed I was, a quiet old woman, recently widowed, too tired to fight, too fragile to question what was being taken from her. And I could see that belief reflected in Olivia's eyes as she tilted her head slightly and glanced at Daniel, sharing a look that didn't need words, a look that said everything had gone exactly as planned. And when Mr. Cole finally spoke, his voice, steady and professional as he read the clause that removed my name entirely from the estate, Olivia's smile widened just enough to reveal the satisfaction she could no longer conceal. And for a brief second, Daniel exhaled as though relieved, as though this outcome had been weighing on him and was now resolved. And I wondered if he realized what that small moment of relief revealed about him, about the choices he had made. But I said nothing, because there are moments in life when silence is not weakness, it is preparation. And as I lifted my eyes to meet Olivia's, I allowed myself the smallest, faintest smile, not the kind that seeks approval or offers forgiveness, but the kind that comes from knowing something the other person does not. And she didn't notice it. Of course, she was too focused on her victory, too certain that the story had already ended, and that was her first mistake. I remember the way the sunlight fell across my kitchen table that morning, soft and golden, as if nothing in the world had changed, as if the house had not grown impossibly quiet in the weeks since my husband passed. And I sat there with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the empty chair across from me where he used to sit, reading the newspaper and making small comments about things that never seemed important until they were gone. And I had told myself that I would be fine, that after 46 years of marriage I knew how to carry on, how to manage a home, how to keep the routines that had defined my life. But what I had not prepared for was the subtle shift in the air, the way Daniel stopped calling as often, the way his visits became shorter, more formal, as though I had somehow become a distant relative instead of his mother. And when he did come by, Olivia was always with him, always just a step behind, watching everything with that quiet attentiveness that felt less like care and more like calculation. And I began to notice the small things, the questions that seemed harmless at first, how much the property taxes were, whether I had considered downsizing, if I had thought about moving somewhere more manageable for someone my age. And each time I would answer calmly, even kindly, because I had always believed that patience was the foundation of family, that understanding could smooth over any rough edge. But there was something about the way she asked those questions that lingered long after they left, something that made the house feel less like my home and more like something being evaluated, measured, quietly assessed for its value. And then there was the afternoon Daniel stood in the doorway of the living room, his hands in his pockets, avoiding my eyes as he mentioned that it might be a good idea to review the estate documents, just to make sure everything was up to date. And I remember nodding, telling him that his father and I had already taken care of everything years ago, that there was nothing to worry about. But he did not look reassured. He only glanced toward Olivia, who gave the smallest nod, as if confirming something unspoken between them. And that was the moment the unease settled fully into place, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and steady, like a clock ticking in a room you cannot quite see. And later that evening, after they had gone, I walked through each room of the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, the photographs lining the hallway, and I realized that every memory here had been built with intention, with care, and yet somewhere along the way, someone had begun to see it not as a life, but as an opportunity. And I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, listening to the silence, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that the danger was not outside my door, but already sitting at my table, smiling politely, waiting for the right moment to take everything I had left. The next afternoon, the call came at exactly 2:14, a time so precise it stayed with me long after I hung up, and I remember watching the phone ring on the counter for a moment before answering, as if some part of me already understood that whatever waited on the other end would not be simple. And when I finally picked it up, the voice that greeted me was calm, measured, and immediately familiar in its tone, even though I had not heard it in years. It was a voice shaped by decades of careful words and quiet authority, and he introduced himself as Harrison Cole, my husband's former attorney, the one who had handled several of our legal matters before Daniel insisted on bringing in someone new last year. And there was a pause after he said his name, just long enough for me to recognize that this was not a casual call, not a friendly check-in, but something deliberate, something that had waited for the right moment to arrive. And he asked if I had a few minutes to talk, and I said yes, though my hand had already tightened slightly around the phone. And he began carefully, almost cautiously, explaining that he had recently reviewed a set of documents connected to my husband's estate, documents that had not been part of the original filing Daniel had mentioned. And there was a subtle shift in his voice as he spoke, something that carried both concern and restraint, as though he were choosing each word with precision. And he told me that my husband had come to see him privately about 3 months before he passed, a visit that had not been shared with anyone else, not even me. And I felt something inside me still at that revelation, not pain exactly, but a quiet awareness that there had been things my husband had chosen to handle on his own, things he had perhaps believed I would not need to worry about. And Mr. Cole continued, explaining that during that meeting, my husband had insisted on adding a supplemental document to his will, something legally binding but intentionally separate from the main version. And I walked slowly to the dining room as he spoke, lowering myself into the chair that still faced my husband's empty place, my fingers resting against the polished surface of the table as if grounding myself in something solid. And I asked him what kind of document it was, though I already sensed the answer would change everything. And there was another pause, longer this time, before he replied that it was a conditional clause, one that would only become relevant under very specific circumstances my husband had described in careful detail. And as I listened, the pieces began to align in a way that was both unsettling and strangely clarifying. The questions Olivia had asked, the sudden urgency around updating paperwork, the quiet distance in Daniel's behavior, all of it forming a pattern that no longer felt accidental. And Mr. Cole's voice softened slightly as he explained that my husband had been concerned about the possibility of undue influence, about decisions being made under pressure or without full transparency. And he had wanted a safeguard in place, something that would ensure fairness even if appearances suggested otherwise. And I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing my husband sitting across from this same man, speaking in that steady, thoughtful way he always had when something truly mattered. And I realized then that this call was not simply information, it was a warning that had arrived just in time. And when I finally spoke again, my voice was calm, almost detached, as I asked Mr. Cole what I needed to do next, and he answered without hesitation that, for now, I should do nothing at all, that I should allow events to unfold exactly as they were being planned. And I understood immediately what he meant, that sometimes the most powerful position is not the one that reacts, but the one that waits. And as I ended the call and set the phone down gently on the table, I looked around the quiet room and felt that same stillness settle over me again. But this time it was different. No longer empty, no longer uncertain. It was focused, deliberate, and, for the first time since my husband's passing, I was no longer simply remembering the life we had built. I was preparing to protect it. I did exactly what Mr. Cole advised. I did nothing, at least not in any way they could see. And over the next 2 days, I moved through my routines with the same quiet consistency I had always maintained, making my coffee in the morning, watering the small garden behind the house, folding laundry that no one else ever seemed to notice. And when Daniel called, I answered with the same gentle tone he had grown used to, asking about his work, about the weather, about anything that did not require him to look too closely at me. And I could hear the slight hesitation in his voice, the way he seemed to be listening for something, perhaps expecting resistance or questions, but I gave him neither. And when he mentioned that the will reading had been scheduled, that it would be a simple process, just a formality, I responded with a soft agreement, as if I had no reason to believe otherwise. And later that afternoon, when they came by together, Olivia walked into my home with that same composed elegance she carried everywhere, her eyes sweeping across the room with a familiarity that felt almost proprietary, and she commented on how well everything had been maintained, how impressive it was for someone my age to keep such a large place in order, her words polished, almost complimentary, but carrying an undertone that suggested this was not a long-term arrangement. And I smiled politely, thanking her, offering tea, moving through the motions of hospitality that had once been genuine, but now felt like part of a quiet performance. And as we sat in the living room, Daniel brought up the future again, carefully, as though the topic required a certain delicacy, mentioning that after everything was settled, it might be worth considering a change, something smaller, something easier. And I listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, allowing the conversation to unfold exactly as they intended. And I could see it in Olivia's posture, the subtle relaxation in her shoulders, the way she leaned slightly closer to Daniel, as if reinforcing his words, without speaking. And it became clear that they had already decided what my future should look like, that in their minds, this house, this life, had already begun to shift into their control, and yet they still felt the need to present it as a suggestion, as something done for my benefit. And I let them, because every word they spoke, every assumption they made, was another step deeper into the certainty that would undo them. And when they finally left, the house returned to its familiar silence. But it no longer felt empty. It felt observant, as if it too were waiting. And that evening, I stood in the hallway looking at the framed photographs of our family over the years, birthdays, holidays, small moments captured in time. And I noticed how the expressions had changed in the more recent pictures, how Olivia's smile had always been just slightly sharper, how Daniel's eyes had grown more distant, and I wondered how long this shift had been happening without me fully seeing it, how many small decisions had been made without my knowledge. And yet despite that realization, I felt no urgency to confront them, no need to expose what I now understood, because the truth has a way of revealing itself when it is given enough space. And as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I carried with me a quiet certainty that the moment they believed they had secured everything would be the exact moment it would all begin to unravel. The morning of the reading arrived with a kind of quiet precision that made everything feel inevitable. The sky clear, the air cool, the world outside moving forward as though nothing of consequence was about to happen. And I dressed with the same care I had always taken for important occasions, choosing a simple navy dress, modest, appropriate, the kind that did not draw attention but carried a sense of dignity. And as I fastened the small clasp at my wrist, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw not the fragile widow they seemed to believe I had become, but someone far steadier, someone who understood that strength does not always need to be seen to be effective. And when Daniel arrived to pick me up, he lingered by the doorway for a moment, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, while Olivia stood just behind him, composed as ever, her expression calm, but carrying that same quiet anticipation I had begun to recognize. And the drive to the office passed with minimal conversation, the kind of careful small talk that fills space without revealing anything of substance. And when we stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeted us again, grounding the moment in something almost formal, almost ritualistic. And we were shown into the same room, the same table, the same arrangement of chairs, everything prepared as though this were simply another routine matter. And I took my seat without hesitation, folding my hands gently in my lap, allowing the silence to settle before Mr. Cole entered with a folder in his hands, his expression composed, professional, yet carrying a subtle weight that I now understood. And as he greeted us and began to speak, Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed, confident, as if the outcome had already been decided long before we arrived. And Daniel mirrored that stillness, though his gaze remained fixed on the table, avoiding mine, and I watched them both with quiet attention, noting the ease in Olivia's breathing, the faint curve of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth, the way her fingers rested lightly against the arm of her chair, as though she were simply waiting for confirmation of something she already knew. And when Mr. Cole began to read, his voice steady and measured, outlining the distribution of assets, the formal language flowing with practiced clarity, I did not interrupt, did not react. Even as my name was omitted entirely, even as the structure they had built revealed itself exactly as they intended, and beside me, Olivia exhaled softly, a barely contained release of tension, followed by that same small laugh she had given before, light, dismissive, as though the moment required nothing more than acknowledgement, and I allowed it. I allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for her confidence to settle fully into place, because there is a particular kind of certainty that blinds people, a certainty that convinces them they have already won. And as I lifted my eyes toward Mr. Cole, I noticed the slight pause in his movements, the way his hand rested briefly on the edge of the document before him, and I understood that we had reached the point where appearances would begin to shift, and yet I remained still, composed, giving nothing away, because timing, I had learned, is not about urgency. It is about precision, and in that quiet, measured space, with Olivia's satisfaction lingering in the air and Daniel's silence pressing against the edges of the room, everything was exactly where it needed to be. Mr. Cole adjusted the papers in front of him with a deliberate calm that did not match the quiet tension building in the room, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just enough to make Olivia shift slightly in her chair, her fingers tightening against the armrest as if she sensed that something had not yet been fully resolved. And then he cleared his throat softly and said there was one additional document that needed to be addressed, his tone even, almost routine. But I noticed the way Daniel's head lifted just slightly, the way his eyes flickered with a hint of uncertainty, as though this was not part of what he had expected. And Olivia's expression held steady for a second longer before a faint crease appeared between her brows, a small fracture in the confidence she had been carrying so effortlessly. And Mr. Cole continued, explaining that this document had been added privately at my husband's request, that it was legally binding and directly connected to the distribution of the estate, and I watched as Olivia leaned forward now, her posture no longer relaxed, her attention fixed entirely on the folder in his hands, and Daniel shifted in his seat, his composure beginning to slip in ways he could not quite control, and still I said nothing, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze steady, because this was the moment my husband had prepared for, the moment he had quietly anticipated long before any of us had acknowledged it. And when Mr. Cole opened the second document, the sound of the paper unfolding seemed louder than it should have been, sharp in the stillness, and he began to read, outlining a conditional clause that had been placed on the inheritance, a clause that required any beneficiary to demonstrate respect and good faith toward me, to act without manipulation, without coercion, without any attempt to undermine my position or remove me unfairly from decisions that affected my life. And I saw the color shift in Olivia's face, subtle at first, then undeniable, as the meaning of those words settled in, and Daniel's expression changed as well, the realization moving slowly across his features as though he were trying to catch up with something already in motion. And Mr. Cole did not pause, did not soften the language. He continued with the same steady cadence, explaining that any violation of these conditions would result in immediate disqualification from the inheritance, that the assets would instead be redirected according to the secondary provisions outlined in the document. And there it was, clear and undeniable, the safeguard my husband had put in place, the quiet protection he had arranged when he must have sensed that something was not right, and for the first time since we entered that room, Olivia said nothing, her lips pressed together, her eyes fixed on the table as if refusing to fully meet what had just been revealed. and Daniel looked between us, confusion and something deeper, something closer to regret, beginning to surface in his expression, and I remained still, composed, not out of indifference, but out of understanding, because this was not a moment that required reaction. It required presence. And as the final words of the document settled into the air, the certainty that had filled the room only minutes before began to unravel quietly, precisely, exactly as it had been intended. The silence that followed was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, like something fragile giving way under pressure, and I could see it in the way Olivia's posture shifted, the confidence she had worn so effortlessly now replaced by a stillness that felt forced, as though she were trying to hold everything in place by sheer will. And Daniel looked at Mr. Cole, then at the document, then finally at me, his expression uncertain in a way I had not seen since he was a child trying to understand something beyond him. And for a moment, no one spoke, the weight of the words settling into the room with quiet precision. And then Olivia let out a small, controlled breath and asked, her voice measured but tighter than before, what exactly constituted a violation of those conditions. And Mr. Cole answered without hesitation, explaining that any action taken to deliberately exclude me, to diminish my role, or to manipulate the distribution of assets without my knowledge or consent would be considered a breach. And I watched as the meaning of that settled over her. Not all at once, but in layers, each realization pressing further into the certainty she had carried into that room. And Daniel's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers tightening slightly, as if he were beginning to see the situation from a perspective he had avoided until now. And still I remained quiet, not out of restraint alone, but because there was nothing I needed to add. The truth was already present, already doing what it needed to do. And Olivia shifted again, this time more noticeably, her composure beginning to fracture in subtle ways, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered toward Daniel, as if searching for confirmation or support. But he did not meet her gaze, and that small absence spoke louder than anything he could have said. And Mr. Cole continued, clarifying that the clause had been designed specifically to protect me from undue influence, that it was not a suggestion but a binding condition, and that any evidence of manipulation, whether direct or indirect, would automatically trigger the redistribution outlined in the document. And the room seemed to grow quieter with each word, not because there was less to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was becoming unmistakably clear. And Olivia's hands, once so relaxed, now rested rigidly in her lap, her fingers no longer still but subtly restless, as if trying to find something solid to hold on to. And Daniel finally looked up, his eyes moving toward me with a hesitation that carried something deeper than confusion, something closer to recognition. And I held his gaze for a brief moment, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a calm that left no room for misinterpretation. And then I looked away, allowing the moment to pass without forcing it into something it did not need to be, because this was not about confrontation, it was about consequence. And as Mr. Cole closed the document and placed it carefully on the table, the certainty that had once filled the room was gone entirely, replaced by something far more fragile, something uncertain and shifting. And in that quiet, measured space, it became clear that what they had believed to be the end of the story was, in fact, only the beginning of something they were no longer in control of. Olivia was the first to break the silence, though her voice lacked the smooth confidence it had carried before, and she leaned forward slightly, her expression carefully composed, as if she could still regain control of the situation by framing it differently, asking whether this clause was truly enforceable in a practical sense, whether it required some formal determination or if it was merely a general guideline. And Mr. Cole met her question with the same steady professionalism, explaining that the clause was not subjective, that it had been written with precise legal language and supported by documented intent, and that any clear pattern of behavior demonstrating exclusion or manipulation would be sufficient to activate it. And I watched as Olivia absorbed that answer, not with acceptance, but with calculation, her mind moving quickly through possibilities, searching for a way to reinterpret what had already been made clear. And beside her, Daniel shifted again, his posture no longer aligned with hers, his attention divided between the document and the space in front of him, as though he were trying to retrace steps he had already taken, And I could see the moment he began to understand that this was not something that could simply be explained away, that the decisions made in quiet conversations and subtle actions had now been placed under a light that could not be dimmed, and still I remained composed, my hands resting calmly, my presence steady, because there was no advantage in speaking too soon, no need to interrupt the process unfolding exactly as it was meant to. And Olivia tried once more, her tone softer now, almost conciliatory, suggesting that perhaps there had been misunderstandings, that any discussions about the future had been made with good intentions, with concern for what would be best for everyone involved, and her words were carefully chosen, polished in a way that might have been convincing under different circumstances, but the room itself seemed to hold them at a distance, as if the truth that had already been revealed left no space for reinterpretation, and Mr. Cole acknowledged her statement with a slight nod, but did not adjust his position, reiterating that intent would be evaluated based on actions, not explanations, and that the clause had been designed specifically to prevent the kind of ambiguity she was now attempting to introduce. And I noticed the way her composure tightened again, not outwardly breaking, but narrowing, becoming more rigid, more controlled, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than I expected, asking what would happen next, and the question hung in the air with a weight that neither of them had anticipated when they entered the room, and Mr. Cole answered that the process would continue as outlined, that the conditions would be reviewed in light of the events that had already occurred, and that a determination would be made accordingly, and there was something final in his tone, something that closed the door on negotiation without needing to state it directly, and I looked at Daniel. Then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since we arrived, and in that brief exchange, I saw the shift complete itself, the realization settling into place not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet acknowledgement of consequence, and I did not look away immediately. I allowed that understanding to remain between us for a moment longer, not as accusation, but as clarity, and then I returned my gaze to the table, allowing the room to settle once more into that measured silence, because everything that needed to be understood had already been said, and what remained now was not a question of if, but of how the outcome would unfold. The meeting did not end with raised voices or sudden movement. It ended the way everything else in that room had unfolded, quietly, and with a kind of finality that did not need to announce itself. And as Mr. Cole gathered the documents in front of him, aligning each page with careful precision, the absence of sound became more telling than anything that had been said, and Olivia remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, her posture held together by habit rather than certainty, her eyes fixed on the table as if searching for something that was no longer there. And when she finally stood, the motion lacked the effortless confidence she had carried in with her, replaced instead by a measured restraint, as though every step now required consideration, and Daniel followed more slowly, his movements uncertain, his gaze lingering briefly on the folder in Mr. Cole's hands before shifting toward me. And there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not just confusion, but recognition, the quiet understanding that the choices he had made had led him to a place he could not easily step away from. And I rose as well, smoothing the fabric of my dress with a simple motion, the same small gesture I had made countless times before, and for a moment we all stood there in that shared space, the distance between us unchanged in inches but altered in every other way that mattered. And Olivia was the first to speak, her voice controlled but thinner now, offering a polite acknowledgement to Mr. Cole, thanking him for his time in a tone that attempted to restore some sense of normalcy. But it did not settle, it did not hold, and he responded with the same professional courtesy, though there was a quiet firmness beneath it that made it clear the matter had moved beyond conversation. And as we turned to leave, Daniel hesitated, his hand pausing on the back of his chair, as if he were considering saying something, anything, that might bridge the space that had formed, but the words did not come, and I did not wait for them, because some moments do not require dialogue to be understood, and we walked out together, the hallway stretching ahead in a straight, unbroken line, the sound of our footsteps soft against the floor, and when we reached the exit, the sunlight outside felt sharper, more defined, as though the world itself had shifted slightly while we were inside. And Olivia stepped forward first, her pace quicker now, her attention fixed ahead, unwilling to look back, and Daniel lingered just long enough to glance toward me again, his expression searching, uncertain, but I met it with the same calm I had carried throughout, not unkind, not distant, simply steady, and then I turned and walked toward my own car, my steps unhurried, my posture unchanged, and I did not look back, not because I could not, but because I did not need to, and as I settled into the driver's seat and closed the door, the quiet of the interior surrounded me in a familiar way, the kind of quiet that does not demand anything, that simply exists, and I sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. And I understood then that nothing had been taken from me in that room, nothing that truly belonged to me, because what mattered had never been written in those documents. It had been built over years, in choices, in values, in the quiet strength my husband had trusted me to carry forward. And as I started the engine and pulled away, the past remained behind me, not lost, but settled, exactly where it needed to be.